The Lioness should have torn Jake McGraw apart the moment he stepped onto his porch, but instead she did something that stopped his heart. She bowed her massive head and pushed her bleeding cub toward his boots, begging him to save the one thing she couldn't. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Jake McGraw had seen plenty of strange things during his 15 years working the Montana frontier, but nothing could have prepared him for what waited on his porch that September morning. The sun was barely cresting the horizon when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong anywhere near his remote homestead. Not the familiar howl of wolves or the distant bugle of elk, but something that made his blood run cold and his heart race with a mixture of fear and wonder. A lion's roar, low and desperate, coming from just outside his cabin door. He'd built this place with his own 2 hands 5 years ago, choosing the isolation deliberately after too many years of crowded cities and the suffocating expectations of family who never understood why a man might prefer the company of mountains and sky to marble halls and society dinners. His father had called him a fool for leaving behind the McGraw shipping fortune. His mother had wept, certain he was throwing his life away on some romantic notion of frontier living that would kill him before he turned 40. But Jake had needed this, needed the honest work of splitting logs and mending fences, needed the clarity that came from knowing exactly what each day would demand of him. The cabin sat in a small valley surrounded by dense pine forest with a creek running cold and clear just 50 yards from his front steps. It was a good spot, protected from the worst of the winter winds, with enough flat land for a small corral and the vegetable garden that kept him fed through the long months when snow made the trip to town impossible. He'd chosen it partly for the beauty, partly for the solitude, and partly because it was so far from any established settlement that visitors were rare and usually unwelcome. That morning, he'd been making coffee on his wood stove, planning his day around repairing a section of fence that had taken damage during last week's storm. The routine was comfortable, predictable, exactly what he'd been seeking when he left Boston 3 years after his wife Sarah had died of pneumonia. Some men drowned their grief in whiskey. Jake had drowned his in distance and hard labor, and most days it almost worked. The roar came again, closer this time, and unmistakably feline. Jake grabbed his rifle from its place above the door and moved to the window, pulling back the simple cloth curtain he'd sewn himself during his first winter here. What he saw made him question whether he was still asleep, caught in some fevered dream brought on by bad jerky or tainted water. A lioness stood at the bottom of his porch steps, not a mountain lion, which would have been remarkable enough in this part of Montana, but an African lioness, her tawny coat catching the early morning light, her amber eyes fixed on his door with an intensity that seemed almost human in its desperation. She was magnificent and terrifying, easily 400 pounds of predatory power, and she was making a sound he'd never heard before. A low, keening cry that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Jake's mind raced through possibilities. Circus train derailment? Some rich man's exotic menagerie escaped. He'd heard stories of wealthy folks back east keeping strange animals, but this was Montana territory, hundreds of miles from anything that could explain a full-grown African lion appearing on his doorstep like a lost dog seeking shelter. The lioness took a step forward, and Jake raised his rifle instinctively, his finger finding the trigger even as something in her posture made him hesitate. She wasn't stalking, wasn't displaying the taut readiness of a predator about to attack. Instead, she looked almost supplicating, her great head lowered, her ears not pinned back in aggression, but forward, alert, pleading. Then she did something that would change the course of Jake's carefully isolated life forever. She turned her head and made a soft, chuffing sound, the kind of vocalization he'd read about in the natural history books he kept on his shelf. A call to her young, and from the shadows beneath his porch, from the crawl space where skunks sometimes denned in winter, emerged a cub no bigger than a house cat, though its oversized paws promised considerable future growth. The cub was injured. Even from inside the cabin, Jake could see the awkward way it moved, favoring its left front leg, and there was something wrong with its face, a dark staining around its muzzle that could only be blood. The little creature made a sound, half mew and half growl, that would have been endearing under different circumstances. Its mother responded immediately, moving to the cub and nosing it gently, her enormous tongue rasping across its injured face with surprising tenderness. Jake stood frozen at his window, rifle still raised but forgotten, watching as the lioness looked up at him again. Their eyes met through the glass, and he would swear until his dying day that something passed between them in that moment. Not words, nothing so simple as that, but an understanding that transcended species and circumstance. She was asking for help. This apex predator, this creature that could tear him apart without breaking a sweat, was begging him to save her cub. The logical part of Jake's mind, the part that had kept him alive through harsh winters and close encounters with grizzlies, was screaming at him to stay inside, to fire a warning shot, to do anything except what he was actually considering. But there was another part of him, the part that had watched Sarah slip away despite every doctor and every prayer, the part that had felt utterly helpless in the face of suffering he couldn't prevent, that was already moving toward the door. He lowered the rifle slowly, deliberately, and watched the lioness track the movement. She didn't attack, didn't even tense. Instead, she stepped back from her cub, giving him space, giving him access to her most precious thing in a gesture of trust that humbled him more than any cathedral ever had. Jake took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening in this remote corner of creation, and opened his door. The morning air hit Jake's face as he stepped onto the porch, cool and pine-scented, carrying with it the reality of what he was attempting. The lioness remained perfectly still, watching him with those intelligent amber eyes as he moved slowly down the 3 wooden steps that separated his door from the ground. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to slam that door and barricade himself inside until this impossible situation resolved itself somehow. But the cub's soft whimpering pulled him forward, step by careful step, until he was standing less than 10 feet from a predator that could end his life in seconds. Jake had always been good with animals. Back in Boston, before Sarah's death had hollowed him out, he'd volunteered at the city's zoological garden, fascinated by the creatures that seemed so out of place in their caged enclosures. The head keeper, an old German immigrant named Klaus, had taught him that animals responded to confidence and calm, that they could sense fear and uncertainty, like blood in water. Jake forced his breathing to steady, kept his movements slow and deliberate, and tried to project a certainty he absolutely did not feel. The cub was in worse shape than he'd initially thought. As he knelt beside it, keeping the lioness in his peripheral vision, he could see the deep gash across its left cheek, still seeping blood despite the mother's attempts to clean it. The front leg was definitely injured, possibly broken, and the little creature's breathing was shallow and rapid, signs of shock or infection or both. Without intervention, this cub would die, probably within the next day or two. The knowledge settled over Jake like a familiar coat. He'd seen enough death to recognize its approach. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his intentions, and placed his hand gently on the cub's flank. The fur was surprisingly soft, and beneath it, he could feel the rapid hammer of a small heart working too hard. The cub flinched at his touch but didn't pull away, as if it understood on some instinctive level that this strange creature meant help, not harm. Jake glanced up at the mother, expecting at any moment to see her charge, to feel those massive jaws close around his neck, but she simply watched, her expression unreadable, but her body language still non-aggressive. He had medical supplies inside, remnants from his careful preparations for frontier living. Jake had learned the hard way that help could be days away in an emergency, that self-sufficiency meant being your own doctor, veterinarian, and surgeon when circumstances demanded. He'd stitched up his own leg after a fall from his horse 2 winters ago, had treated infections and set broken fingers, had even delivered a neighbor's calf during a difficult birth last spring. But this was different. This was a wild animal, an exotic predator, and he was operating on instinct and hope rather than any real knowledge. Moving slowly, he scooped the cub into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, maybe 20 pounds of solid muscle despite its young age, and it made a sound of protest that immediately brought the lioness to her feet. Jake froze, holding the cub against his chest, feeling its heart beating against his own, and met the mother's eyes directly. This was the moment. Either she trusted him or she didn't, and his life depended entirely on her decision. The lioness took 2 steps forward, her massive paws silent on the hard-packed earth, and Jake prepared himself for the end. It had been a good life, mostly. Lonely these past years, but good in its way, honest and clean, and far from the lies and pretensions he'd fled. If this was how it ended, trying to save something innocent and hurt, there were worse ways to die. But the lioness didn't attack. Instead, she moved past him, brushing so close that he could feel the heat radiating from her body, could smell the wild musk of her fur, and she walked up his porch steps. At the door, she turned and looked back at him, and the message was unmistakable. She was coming inside with him. She would not be separated from her cub. Jake's small cabin had never been designed for guests, let alone a 400-pound African lioness. The single room served as bedroom, kitchen, and living space, with a loft above for storage and a small root cellar below for food preservation. It was barely 300 square feet of carefully organized bachelor living, and the idea of sharing it with an apex predator was beyond absurd. But the cub in his arms was growing weaker with each passing minute, and standing in his yard debating the wisdom of his choices wasn't going to save it. He climbed the steps slowly, the cub cradled carefully, and pushed open the door with his boot. The lioness entered first, her great head swiveling as she took in this strange human den with its unfamiliar smells and odd furnishings. She moved with surprising grace through the space, investigating but not destroying, and finally settled herself near the cold wood stove, her eyes never leaving her cub. Jake laid the little one on his kitchen table, the same rough-hewn surface where he took his solitary meals and read his books by lamplight. The cub's eyes were glazed with pain and fever, and up close the infection was obvious, the wound on its face angry and inflamed, the leg swollen to nearly twice its normal size. He'd need to clean the wounds, possibly stitch the facial laceration, and definitely splint that leg. The question was whether he could do all of that before the cub went into shock, or the mother decided she'd made a terrible mistake trusting a human. His medical kit sat on a shelf near his bed, a wooden box his father had given him before he left Boston, filled with supplies that had saved Jake's life more than once. He retrieved it quickly, along with clean rags and the bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes and occasional evenings when the loneliness grew too loud. The lioness watched his every movement, her tail twitching occasionally, but she made no move to interfere as he began laying out what he'd need. Jake heated water on the stove, grateful that he'd started a fire earlier for his morning coffee, and used it to dampen the clean rags. The cub barely reacted as he began cleaning the facial wound, carefully removing dried blood and dirt, revealing the extent of the damage. Something had attacked this little one, something with claws or perhaps barbed wire from a fence. The gash ran from just below its left eye to its jaw, deep enough that Jake could see muscle tissue beneath. It would need stitches, careful work that would test his limited surgical skills. The mother made a low sound as he threaded his needle, not quite a growl, but not friendly either, a warning that he was being watched and judged with every action. Jake spoke to her softly as he worked, the same soothing nonsense he used to calm skittish horses, keeping his voice low and steady even though his hands wanted to shake. The first stitch went through the cub's skin with surprising ease, the needle-piercing flesh that was softer than the tough cowhide Jake was accustomed to working with. The little one whimpered and tried to pull away, but weakness kept it still on the table, its small body trembling with each pass of the thread. Jake had stitched wounds before on himself and on livestock, but never had he felt such pressure, such awareness that one wrong move could trigger an attack from the massive predator, watching his every motion from across the room. His hands worked with a steadiness born of necessity rather than confidence. Each stitch had to be precise, close enough to hold the wound shut, but not so tight that it would tear the delicate tissue. The cub's face would scar, he knew that much, a permanent reminder of whatever encounter had brought it to his doorstep. But scars were better than death, and death was what awaited if infection continued to spread through that small body unchecked. The lioness made another sound, softer this time, almost conversational, and Jake glanced up to find her standing now, her body language tense but not aggressive. She was closer than before, having moved while he concentrated on his work, and now stood less than 5 feet away, near enough that he could count the whiskers on her broad muzzle, could see the flecks of gold in her amber eyes. She was studying his work, he realized with a start, watching the needle and thread with an intelligence that seemed far beyond what any animal should possess. Jake finished the last stitch and tied it off carefully, then used his shears to trim the excess thread. The wound looked better already, the edges pulled together neatly, though the surrounding skin was still inflamed and hot to the touch. He reached for the bottle of carbolic acid solution he kept for disinfecting, knowing this next part would hurt the cub badly and possibly provoke the mother beyond her tolerance. But infection would kill more surely than any predator, and he'd come too far to stop now out of fear. The cub's scream when the antiseptic hit its wound was unlike anything Jake had heard before, a sound of pure agony that seemed to fill his small cabin and reverberate off the log walls. The lioness exploded into motion, covering the distance between them in a single bound that demonstrated exactly why she was an apex predator. Jake barely had time to raise his hands before she was there, her massive head level with his chest, her hot breath washing over him in waves that smelled of raw meat in wild places. But she didn't bite, didn't strike. Instead, she pushed between Jake and her cub, creating a barrier with her own body, and made a sound that was part roar and part something else entirely, something that spoke of a mother's protective fury held barely in check. Jake stood frozen, his hands still raised in a gesture of surrender, waiting to see if he'd finally pushed her too far. If this was where his attempt at kindness would end in blood and regret. The cub cried out again, not from Jake's treatment this time, but from its own pain and fear. And the sound seemed to break through the lioness's rage. She turned her great head to look at her offspring, then back at Jake. And in that moment, he saw something he would remember for the rest of his life. Recognition, understanding, the knowledge that what he was doing, however painful, was necessary for survival. The lioness stepped aside slowly, deliberately, and settled herself on the floor directly beside the table, positioning herself where she could watch both Jake and her cub simultaneously. Permission granted, but with clear boundaries. Jake released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and returned to his work, his hands shaking now with released tension. The leg was next, and he approached it gingerly, feeling along the small bones for breaks or fractures. The cub whimpered, but didn't fight, exhausted by pain and the trauma of treatment. About halfway down the foreleg, Jake's fingers found what he'd been dreading, a distinct break in the bone, clean enough that it might heal well with proper setting, but requiring manipulation that would cause agony. He had splinted broken bones before, on a neighbor's dog and once on a ranch hand who'd fallen from his horse, but never on anything quite like this. The cub's leg was small and delicate despite the oversized paws, and Jake worried about causing more damage with his clumsy human fingers, But leaving it unset would mean permanent injury, a crippling that would doom the cub even if it survived the infection. Nature had no use for the weak or lame, especially among predators who relied on speed and strength for survival. Working as gently as he could, Jake aligned the broken bone, feeling it click into place through the swollen tissue. The cub screamed again, and this time the lioness didn't intervene, though her ears laid flat against her skull and her tail lashed once, twice, 3 times against the cabin floor with enough force to rattle his dishes. Jake wrapped the leg carefully, using strips of cloth he'd torn from an old shirt, creating a firm but not constricting bandage that would hold the bone in place while it healed. Over this, he applied thin wooden slats from kindling he'd split for the stove, binding them in place to create a splint that was crude but functional. The whole process had taken maybe 30 minutes, but it felt like hours, and Jake discovered his shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cool morning air. The cub lay quiet now, its breathing still rapid but more regular. The initial crisis passed. It would need more care in the coming days. The wound would require cleaning and fresh bandages. The splint would need adjustment as swelling went down, but Jake thought it might actually survive, might actually heal and grow into the magnificent creature its mother already was. He stepped back from the table, giving the lioness space to approach her cub, and watched as she stood and moved forward with surprising gentleness. Her rough tongue rasped across the cub's face, carefully avoiding the fresh stitches, and she made soft chuffing sounds that were clearly meant to comfort and reassure. The little one responded with weak, mewling cries, seeking its mother's warmth and presence after the trauma of treatment. Jake moved to his wash basin and cleaned his hands thoroughly, washing away blood and antiseptic and the lingering sense of unreality that clung to everything about this morning. When he turned back, the lioness had settled herself on the floor beside the table, her body curved protectively around it, her great head resting on her paws. She was watching him still, those amber eyes never leaving his face, and in them Jake saw something that might have been gratitude, or might simply have been the acknowledgement of a temporary truce between species that normally existed in opposition. The practical reality of having a lioness living in his cabin hit Jake somewhere around mid-morning when he realized he had no idea what to feed her. The cub needed rest and time to heal, but its mother was a 400-pound carnivore who hadn't eaten recently, if the sharp angles of her ribs were any indication. He had salt pork hanging in his root cellar, some dried venison from last fall's hunt, and the remains of a rabbit he'd snared 2 days ago. None of it seemed adequate for a creature designed to bring down zebras and wildebeest on the African plains. He stood in his small kitchen area, the lioness watching him from her position beside the table where her cub now slept fitfully, and tried to think through his options. The nearest town, Millerville, was a hard day's ride away, and he couldn't exactly waltz into the general store asking for enough meat to feed an African lion. Even if he could, leaving the animals alone seemed foolish, when the cub might take a turn for the worse at any moment, and the mother might decide that closed doors and human walls were more cage than sanctuary. The answer came to him as he looked out his window toward the small corral where he kept his 2 horses, a sturdy bay mare named Juniper, and an aging gelding called Roosevelt. Beyond the corral, the forest stretched for miles, full of deer and elk this time of year, fattening themselves for the coming winter. Jake was a decent hunter, had kept himself fed through 5 Montana winters with rifle and trap, and if the lioness could tolerate his absence for a few hours, he could bring back enough fresh meat to keep her fed while they figured out what came next. The decision made, Jake gathered his hunting gear with practiced efficiency, his rifle, already loaded and checked that morning, his skinning knife, honed to razor sharpness the previous evening, his pack with rope and basic supplies. He moved quietly but not furtively, aware that any sign of sneaking or suspicious behavior might alarm the lioness, who continued to track his movements with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. Before leaving, he approached the table slowly, keeping his hands visible and his movements predictable. The cub was sleeping now, its breathing deeper and more regular than before, the fever that had radiated from its small body seeming to have lessened slightly. Jake checked the bandages carefully, making sure they remained secure but not too tight, and was surprised when the lioness shifted to give him better access, as if understanding that he needed to examine her offspring. He spoke to her as he worked, his voice low and conversational, telling her his plan to hunt, to bring back food for her, and to check on the cub throughout the day. It felt absurd, explaining himself to an animal that couldn't possibly understand human speech, but something in her bearing suggested she was listening, processing, comprehending in whatever way her lion mind allowed. When he finished his examination and stepped back, she looked at him for a long moment, then deliberately turned her attention back to her cub, dismissing him in a way that felt almost regal. The forest was cool and quiet when Jake entered it an hour later, moving through the familiar territory with the ease of long practice. He'd walked these woods countless times, learning their rhythms and secrets, discovering the game trails and water sources that made successful hunting possible. Today he moved with purpose, tracking a small herd of deer he knew frequented a meadow about 2 miles from his cabin, hoping to bring one down quickly and get back before anything went wrong with his unlikely house guests. The hunt itself was almost anticlimactic. He found the deer exactly where he expected them, grazing peacefully in the morning sun, unaware that a predator watched from the tree line. Jake was a good shot, had been since his father first put a rifle in his hands at age 12, and he made it clean, bringing down a young buck with a single bullet that dropped it instantly. The other deer scattered, bounding away through the trees in graceful panic, but Jake's attention was already on his kill, on the work of field dressing and preparing it for transport. As he worked his knife through hide and muscle, Jake found his thoughts returning to the lioness and her cub waiting in his cabin. How had they gotten here? The question gnawed at him as he separated meat from bone with practiced cuts. African lions didn't just appear in Montana. Someone had brought them here, probably as part of some traveling show or private menagerie, and something had gone catastrophically wrong. The cub's injuries suggested an attack or accident, something that had separated mother and offspring from whatever human keepers they'd had, sending them fleeing into wilderness they weren't designed to survive. The image of the lioness standing on his porch returned to him as he packed the best cuts of venison into his bag, her desperate plea for help transcending species and circumstance. She had chosen his cabin out of all the empty wilderness surrounding them, had somehow sensed or decided that this particular human might be different from whatever humans had failed her before. The weight of that trust sat heavy on Jake's shoulders as he hoisted his pack and began the trek back home. He arrived to find everything exactly as he'd left it, the cabin quiet, except for the soft sounds of the cub's breathing and an occasional rumble from the lioness that might have been a purr or might have been something else entirely. She raised her head as he entered, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of fresh blood, and Jake saw hunger flash across her features, primal and undeniable. He set down his pack carefully and pulled out the best portions of the deer, raw meat still warm from the animal's body. The lioness stood slowly, her attention now completely focused on the food, and Jake had a moment of uncertainty about how to proceed. Did he just toss it to her, set it on a plate like she was some oversized house cat? The absurdity of his situation would have made him laugh under different circumstances. In the end, he laid the meat on the floor near where she stood and backed away, giving her space and privacy to eat. She didn't hesitate, moving forward with fluid grace and beginning to feed with the efficient brutality of a true carnivore. Jake turned away, giving her what dignity he could, and busied himself checking on the cub, whose small chest rose and fell with the steady rhythm of healing sleep. 3 days passed in a strange rhythm that Jake had never experienced before, his solitary existence transformed into something resembling cohabitation with the most unlikely roommates imaginable. The cub, whom Jake had started calling Scout in his own mind, though he'd never spoken the name aloud, was recovering with the remarkable resilience of youth. The fever had broken on the second day, and by the third morning the little one was attempting to move around despite the splinted leg, making soft mewing sounds that brought its mother immediately to attention. The Lioness, whom Jake thought of simply as Lady for lack of any better name, had established her territory within his cabin with the confidence of royalty claiming a palace. She slept near the wood stove at night, her large body curled protectively around Scout, and during the day she alternated between watching Jake with those penetrating amber eyes and staring out the window at the surrounding forest with an expression he could only describe as longing. She was a prisoner here, Jake realized, albeit a voluntary one, staying in this strange human den only because her cub needed time to heal before they could travel. Jake had fallen into a routine of hunting each morning, bringing back fresh meat to keep Lady fed and satisfied. She ate prodigiously, consuming amounts that would have bankrupted him if he'd had to purchase it at town prices, but the forest provided bounty enough for now. He'd brought down another deer, 2 rabbits, and even managed to trap a wild turkey that Lady had devoured with obvious relish, crunching through bones with powerful jaws that reminded Jake exactly how dangerous she was, despite their temporary truce. On the evening of the third day, as Jake sat at his small table eating his own dinner of beans and cornbread, he heard sounds in the distance that made his blood run cold. Dogs barking, multiple animals by the sound of it, and men's voices carrying through the crisp autumn air. They were still far off, maybe a mile or more, but they were definitely heading in the direction of his cabin. Jake stood quickly, moving to the window, and saw Lady already on her feet, her ears pricked forward and her body tense with alertness. The realization hit him with the force of physical blow. Someone was hunting for the lions, of course they were. Exotic animals worth a fortune didn't just vanish without prompting searches and questions and eventually action. Whoever owned these magnificent creatures would want them back, and the method of retrieval probably involved guns and cages and men who saw Lady not as the intelligent being Jake had come to respect, but as property to be reclaimed or problems to be eliminated. Jake moved to his gun cabinet and pulled out his rifle, checking its load with hands that had gone suddenly cold. He had no legal claim to these animals, no right to keep them or protect them from their rightful owners. But the thought of Lady being dragged back to whatever cage or traveling show she'd escaped from, of Scout growing up performing tricks for crowds instead of running free as nature intended, filled him with a fury that surprised him with its intensity. In 3 days, these creatures had become something more than visitors or patients. They'd become his responsibility, his to protect, and he'd be damned if he let them go without a fight. The barking grew closer, and Jake could make out distinct voices now, at least 4 or 5 men by his estimate, maybe more. He thought quickly, weighing options and consequences. His cabin had only 1 door and 2 windows, all facing the front, making it impossible to sneak the lions out unseen if the hunters approached from that direction. The forest behind his property was dense enough to provide cover, but getting there would require time and luck they might not have. Lady was watching him now, and Jake saw recognition in her eyes, the understanding that danger approached and decisions needed to be made. He crossed to where she stood and knelt slowly, making himself eye level with her massive head. What he was about to do was insane, based on nothing but 3 days of uneasy coexistence and a gut feeling that this creature understood far more than any animal should. But desperation made fools of wise men and heroes of cowards, and Jake had already committed himself to this path the moment he'd opened his door that first morning. He gestured toward the back wall of his cabin, then toward the forest beyond, trying to communicate through movement what words could never convey. She needed to run, to take her cub and disappear into the wilderness before the hunters arrived. Jake would buy them time, would delay and misdirect and lie if necessary, but only if Lady trusted him enough to follow his lead one more time. For a long moment, She simply stared at him, her amber eyes boring into his, as if reading the truth of his intentions directly from his soul. Then she moved to where Scout lay sleeping and gently grasped the cub by the scruff of its neck, the same way a house cat might carry a kitten. Scout made a sound of protest but went limp in that instinctive response all young felines shared, allowing its mother to lift it despite the splinted leg and healing wounds. Jake moved quickly to the back window and forced it open, the hinges protesting from disuse. The opening was barely large enough for Lady to fit through, but cats were liquid when they needed to be, and she proved the rule by somehow flowing through the space, with Scout still dangling from her jaws. Jake watched her land gracefully on the ground below, then turned to look back at him one final time. In that moment, something passed between them, an acknowledgement of debt and gratitude, of understanding across the vast divide that separated their species. Jake had saved her cub, had given them both sanctuary and care when they'd needed it most desperately, and now he was risking his own safety to buy them escape. Lady's eyes held his for 3 heartbeats, and then she turned and vanished into the forest with Scout, moving like a tawny ghost between the pine trees. Jake closed the window and took a moment to compose himself, wiping away the evidence of his house guests as best he could in the few minutes he had remaining. He kicked straw over the bloodstains on his floor, tossed the remaining scraps of venison into his root cellar, and straightened his cabin until it looked more or less like the home of a solitary bachelor rather than a temporary hospital for exotic predators. The hunters arrived 20 minutes later, their dogs straining at leashes and baying with the frustrated excitement of animals that had lost a scent trail. Jake was sitting on his porch when they emerged from the tree line, his rifle resting casually across his knees, in a posture that was neither threatening nor welcoming, just the natural wariness of a frontier man greeting unexpected visitors. There were 6 of them, and Jake assessed each one with the quick judgment born of years reading men's characters in situations where misjudgment could prove fatal. The leader was obvious from his position at the front and the way the others deferred to him. A tall man in his 50s with silver hair and expensive hunting clothes that marked him as someone accustomed to wealth and authority. His face was weathered but well-fed, the complexion of a man who spent time outdoors by choice rather than necessity. Behind him came 4 younger men who had the look of hired hands, rough and capable with the hard eyes of men who'd done questionable things for money. The 6th member of their party was different, smaller and older, wearing spectacles and carrying what looked like a medical bag. A veterinarian, Jake guessed, brought along to ensure valuable property wasn't damaged in the recapture. The silver-haired man raised his hand in greeting as they approached, his smile friendly, but his eyes calculating as they swept over Jake's cabin and the surrounding clearing. His dogs, 3 large hounds that looked capable of bringing down a bear, were whining and circling, clearly agitated by lingering scents they couldn't quite locate. "Good afternoon, friend," the man called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of Eastern education. "Name's Clayton Barrow. I own a traveling menagerie that's been touring through Montana territory. We've had some animals escape, and we're tracking them through this area. Wondered if you might have seen anything unusual in the past few days." Jake stood slowly, keeping his rifle low but ready, and studied Barrow with the same careful attention he'd give a rattlesnake coiled in his path. Everything about the man's demeanor was calculated, from his friendly tone to his casual mention of ownership, as if exotic predators were just another form of livestock that might have wandered off like lost cattle. "Unusual how?" Jake asked, his voice deliberately flat and unhelpful. "I see unusual things out here most days. 2 weeks ago, I watched a golden eagle take down a full-grown fox. Last month, there was a white elk drinking from my creek. You'll have to be more specific." Barrow's smile tightened fractionally, a tell that Jake noted and filed away. "Lions," the man said, dropping the pretense of casual conversation, An adult female and her cub escaped 3 nights ago when one of my handlers was careless during feeding time. The female is extremely valuable, trained for years to perform in our show, and the cub represents a significant investment. My dogs tracked their scent to this general area before losing the trail. Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs but kept his expression neutral, giving away nothing. A lion, he repeated, as if the idea was absurd. You're telling me there's an African lion running around Montana, and you think I wouldn't have mentioned seeing something like that first thing? The fact is, Barrow continued, his tone hardening slightly, my dogs are indicating the scent is strong near your property. Very strong, in fact, like the animals spent considerable time here recently. So I'm going to ask you directly, have you seen my lions or do you know where they might be? It wasn't really a question, and Jake heard the threat underlying the polite words. Barrow was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through whatever means necessary, and the hired hands behind him had shifted their stances slightly, hands moving closer to the guns at their hips. This was the moment Jake had been dreading, the point where his lie would either hold or collapse under scrutiny. Mr. Barrow, Jake said, putting just enough edge into his voice to sound offended rather than defensive. I've been living in this cabin for 5 years, and in that time I've learned that wild animals come and go as they please. If your lion passed through my property, which I'm not saying it did since I never saw any such thing, then it's probably 20 miles from here by now. Lions are fast, aren't they? Even ones trained for shows must remember how to run. One of the hired hands started to say something, but Barrow silenced him with a gesture. The older man was studying Jake now with uncomfortable intensity, as if trying to read truth or deception in the set of his shoulders and the steadiness of his gaze. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the restless whining of the dogs and the distant call of a crow somewhere in the forest. Mind if we look around? Barrow asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't really asking permission. Just to satisfy my dogs, you understand. They're rarely wrong about scents, and I'd hate to think you were harboring stolen property even unknowingly. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle, a movement so slight he doubted anyone noticed, but enough to remind himself that he was armed and on his own land. The law out here was what you made it, and while he had no legal right to the lions, Barrow had no legal right to search his property without proper authority. It was a standoff waiting to happen, and Jake knew that how he handled the next 60 seconds would determine whether this ended with words or violence. Actually, I do mind, Jake said quietly, his voice carrying steel beneath the courtesy. This is private property, and you've got no warrant or authority to search it. Your dogs can smell whatever they want from out here, but unless you've got a territorial marshal with proper paperwork, you and your men aren't setting foot inside my cabin or on my land. Barrow's expression darkened, and the hired hands exchanged glances that suggested they were calculating odds and consequences. The veterinarian looked uncomfortable, clearly hoping this wouldn't escalate into something he'd have to witness or participate in. Jake remained motionless on his porch, every muscle coiled and ready despite his casual posture, knowing that he was one wrong word away from a gunfight he probably couldn't win. "You're making a mistake, friend," Barrow said, and the word friend now carried open hostility. "Those lions are worth over $10,000, and anyone who helps them disappear or hinders their recovery will face serious legal consequences. I have connections with territorial authorities, and I promise you that obstructing my search will not end well for you." Jake had faced down armed men before, back during his years in Boston when his father's shipping business occasionally attracted the wrong sort of attention from competitors and criminals alike. He knew the look of men deciding whether violence was worth the potential cost, and he saw it now in the eyes of Barrow's hired hands. They were weighing their employer's orders against the very real possibility that this lone cowboy might drop one or two of them before they could bring him down, and wondering if their pay was worth that risk. "Then go ahead and bring your authorities," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline singing through his veins. "Bring your marshals and your paperwork and your legal claims. But until you do, you're just a man with dogs standing on land that isn't yours, making threats you can't back up without starting something you might not be able to finish. The standoff held for another long moment, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a lightning strike. Then Barrow made a disgusted sound and turned away, gesturing sharply to his men. "We're wasting time here," he announced loudly, though his eyes never left Jake's face. "The tracks continue north anyway. We'll find them before nightfall." But as the hunters prepared to leave, the veterinarian stepped forward, his expression concerned rather than hostile. He was an older gentleman, perhaps 60, with kind eyes behind his spectacles and the bearing of someone whose conscience wouldn't let certain things pass unchallenged. "Excuse me," he said quietly, directing his words to Jake rather than Barrow. "But if you should happen to encounter these animals, you need to understand that the cub is injured. It has a broken leg and facial lacerations that require professional medical attention. Without proper care, infection could kill it within a week." Jake kept his expression carefully neutral, but inside his mind was racing. The veterinarian knew. Maybe not with certainty, but he suspected strongly enough that he was issuing a warning disguised as helpful information. The question was whether he would share those suspicions with Barrow or keep them to himself. "Appreciate the concern," Jake replied carefully. "If I see any injured animals, I'll be sure to handle them appropriately." The veterinarian held his gaze for a moment longer, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that transcended the immediate situation. Then the older man nodded slightly and turned away, following Barrow and the others back toward the tree line. The dogs were still agitated, circling and whining, but their handlers dragged them north, following Barrow's directive, away from Jake's cabin and the truth that lay hidden in the forest behind it. Jake remained on his porch long after they disappeared from sight, listening to the sounds of their passage fade into the distance. Only when he was certain they were truly gone did he allow himself to breathe properly, releasing the tension that had locked his muscles and quickened his heart. That had been closer than he liked, and he knew Barrow wasn't the type to give up easily. The man would likely circle back once darkness fell, or return with proper authorities if he could convince them that his suspicions warranted investigation. The afternoon shadows were lengthening toward evening when Jake finally ventured into the forest behind his cabin, following the route Lady had taken hours earlier. He moved quietly through the pine trees, aware that she might view his approach as a threat, now that the immediate danger had passed. Wild animals were unpredictable even at the best of times, and Lady was far from domesticated despite her remarkable intelligence. He found them about half a mile from his cabin, tucked into a small depression between two fallen logs that created a natural shelter. Lady was lying with Scout curled against her belly, and she raised her head as Jake approached, a low warning rumble emanating from her chest. Jake stopped immediately, raising his hands in a gesture of peace, and spoke softly. "They're gone for now," he said, though he knew his words meant nothing to her. "But they'll be back, probably tonight or tomorrow. You need to keep moving north, get as far from here as you can." Lady watched him with those penetrating amber eyes, and Jake was struck again by the uncanny sense that she understood more than she should. Scout stirred against its mother's belly, making soft mewing sounds, and Jake could see that the cub was stronger than it had been that morning, its eyes brighter and more alert. 3 days of rest and proper care had worked wonders, but the little one was still weeks away from being able to travel long distances or defend itself from predators. Jake knelt slowly, careful to keep distance between himself and the lions, and pulled from his pack the last of the venison he'd preserved. He laid it on the ground and backed away, offering what help he could without getting close enough to trigger Lady's protective instincts. She didn't move toward the meat immediately, but her eyes tracked it, and Jake knew she'd eat once he left. "I wish I could do more," he said quietly. surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "You deserve better than running and hiding, both of you. But at least out here you've got a chance, which is more than you'd have back in Barrow's cages." As if she understood, Lady made a sound that wasn't quite a growl or a purr, but something in between, a vocalization that seemed almost conversational. Scout chose that moment to crawl forward, dragging its splinted leg awkwardly, attempting to reach the meat Jake had left. Lady immediately moved to block her cub, but not before Jake got a good look at the little one's progress. The stitches were holding well, and the swelling in the leg had decreased significantly. Scout would bear scars from this ordeal, both physical and perhaps psychological, but it would survive. Would grow into a strong adult if given the chance. The thought filled Jake with a fierce satisfaction that surprised him with its intensity. He stood slowly, preparing to leave them to their shelter and their uncertain future, but before he could turn away, something remarkable happened. Lady rose to her feet in one fluid motion and walked toward him, closing the distance between them with measured steps. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his hip, but he didn't draw it, couldn't bring himself to treat this moment as a threat when everything in Lady's posture suggested otherwise. She stopped directly in front of him, so close he could feel the heat radiating from her massive body, could count the individual whiskers on her broad muzzle. For a long moment, they simply stood there, man and lion, predator and prey, two beings from entirely different worlds, sharing space and air and mutual respect. Then Lady did something that would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. She pressed her massive head against his chest, not roughly but with deliberate gentleness, and made a sound that was unmistakably a purr, deep and rumbling like distant thunder. The gesture was so clearly one of gratitude, of recognition and farewell, that Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. His hand moved without conscious thought to rest on Lady's head, his fingers sinking into the coarse fur. Feeling the solid reality of this impossible moment, "Thank you" didn't seem adequate, but Jake said it anyway, his voice rough. "You take care of that little one. Make sure Scout grows up knowing how lucky it was to have a mother like you." Lady pulled back slowly, her amber eyes meeting his one final time, and then she turned and walked back to where Scout waited. Jake watched her settle herself protectively around her cub, and he knew this was goodbye. Whatever happened next, whether they survived in this wilderness or not, he would probably never see them again. The thought filled him with unexpected sorrow, as if he was losing something precious he hadn't known he needed. The walk back to his cabin felt longer than it should have, and Jake found himself glancing over his shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see Lady following him, to discover this whole experience had been some elaborate dream. But the forest remained empty except for the normal inhabitants, and when he finally reached his small homestead, the setting sun painted everything in shades of orange and gold that seemed too beautiful for the melancholy settling over his spirit. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the forest, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making him wonder if it was Lady moving through the darkness with Scout, putting distance between themselves and the hunters. Or if it was Barrow's men, circling back to search his property under cover of night. Around midnight, he gave up on rest entirely and sat at his table with a lamp burning low, cleaning his rifle for the third time that day, the repetitive motion soothing his restless mind. The knock on his door came just before dawn, soft but insistent, and Jake's hand moved immediately to his weapon. But when he opened the door cautiously, rifle ready, he found not Barrow or his hired hands, but the veterinarian standing alone in the pre-dawn darkness with his medical bag in hand. "Mr. McGraw," the older man said quietly, though Jake didn't remember giving his name. "My name is Dr. Edmund Pierce. I believe we need to talk about the lions you're not harboring in your cabin." Jake's mind raced through options and possibilities, weighing risks and potential outcomes. Pierce could be a spy sent by Barrow, Or he could be exactly what he appeared to be, a man of conscience troubled by what he'd witnessed. In the end, Jake made the choice his instincts suggested and stepped aside, allowing the veterinarian to enter. Inside, Pierce glanced around the cabin with professional assessment, noting the hastily cleaned bloodstains Jake had tried to scrub from the floorboards, the scattered hay that suggested large animals had recently occupied the space, the lingering scent that no amount of airing could completely eliminate. He nodded slowly, as if confirming suspicions, then turned to face Jake directly. "I won't insult your intelligence by pretending I don't know what happened here," Pierce said. "The cub was injured badly enough to require medical intervention, and you provided it. The mother brought her offspring to you specifically, which suggests remarkable intelligence and desperation on her part. Am I correct in these assumptions?" Jake studied the older man carefully before answering. "Why are you here, Dr. Pierce? If you're working for Barrow, you could have brought him and his men instead of coming alone." Pierce sighed and settled himself into one of Jake's chairs without invitation, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "I'm here because I've spent 30 years working with animals, and in that time I've learned to recognize suffering when I see it. Those lions are suffering, Mr. McGraw. Not from physical injury anymore if your care was competent, but from captivity and exploitation. I've watched Barrow's menagerie for 2 years now, seen how the animals are kept and treated, and it sickens me." "Then why work for him?" Jake asked, some of his tension easing but his suspicion remaining. "Because someone needs to care for those animals, and Barrow pays well enough that I can afford to run a free clinic for farmers who can't afford veterinary care." Pierce's voice carried the weight of compromise and rationalization. "But I draw the line at helping him recapture creatures that clearly chose freedom over captivity. The Lioness didn't escape by accident, Mr. McGraw. She broke out deliberately, tore through reinforced fencing with her bare claws, risked her own life to get her cub away from that traveling prison." Jake felt vindication at hearing his own instincts confirmed by someone with expertise. "What do you want from me?" "Information, primarily. The cub's injuries. How severe were they?" Pierce leaned forward, his professional concern evident. "I need to know if they have a realistic chance of survival in the wild, because if they don't, if that cub is going to die slowly from infection or complications, then perhaps the kindest thing would be to help Barrow find them and provide proper ongoing care." The question hung in the air between them, and Jake recognized the genuine dilemma behind it. Pierce wasn't asking out of loyalty to Barrow, but from authentic concern for the animal's welfare. It was a question Jake had been avoiding asking himself, preferring to focus on the immediate problem of keeping Lady and Scout away from their captors without considering the longer-term implications. "The cub's leg was broken cleanly," Jake said finally, making the decision to trust this man who'd risked Barrow's anger by coming here alone. "I set it as best I could and splinted it properly. The facial laceration required 14 stitches, but I cleaned it thoroughly with carbolic solution. When they left yesterday, Scout was alert, eating, and the fever had broken. The leg will heal crooked without professional care, might leave it with a slight limp, but it won't prevent survival." Pierce absorbed this information with visible relief. "And the mother? She's been eating regularly? No signs of injury or illness?" Jake nodded. "I hunted fresh meat twice daily. She ate well, stayed strong. Protective of the cub, but not aggressive toward me after the first day. Smart enough to understand I was helping." Pierce nodded slowly, processing the information with the careful consideration of a man who understood the stakes involved. "Then they have a chance," he said. "Not a certainty, but a chance. Lions are adaptable predators when they need to be, and the mother clearly possesses exceptional intelligence. If they can reach the high country before winter sets in properly, find territory with adequate game, they might actually survive." Jake felt something ease in his chest at hearing this professional opinion. He'd been telling himself the same thing for days, but having it confirmed by someone with actual expertise made the decision to help them escape feel less like reckless sentiment and more like rational action. "But there's something you need to know," Pierce continued, his expression growing grave. "Barrow isn't going to give up. Those lions represent not just money, but pride to him. He's already sent telegrams to territorial authorities claiming the animals are dangerous, that they've attacked livestock and pose a threat to human life. He's manufacturing a crisis to justify bringing in professional hunters and trackers." The words hit Jake like cold water. "It's all lies," he said flatly. "Lady hasn't attacked anything but the game I brought her." "Of course it's lies," Pierce agreed. "But lies told by a wealthy man with connections carry weight that truth told by a frontier cowboy often doesn't. By tomorrow, there will be armed men scouring these forests with orders to shoot on sight. Barrow will claim he tried to recapture them humanely, that circumstances forced more extreme measures. He'll walk away with his reputation intact and his insurance claim filed." Jake stood abruptly, pacing his small cabin like a caged animal himself. "So what am I supposed to do? I already sent them north, told them to run. What else can I possibly do against men with money and authority?" Pierce reached into his medical bag and pulled out a folded map, spreading it across Jake's table. The lamplight illuminated terrain features and elevation markers, rivers and mountain passes drawn in careful detail. "You can do what Barrow doesn't expect," the veterinarian said, his finger tracing a route through the mountains. "You can lead them to safety before the hunters arrive." Jake stared at the map, understanding dawning with the weight of new responsibility. "You want me to guide them through the mountains?" "There's a valley here." Pierce tapped a location about 60 miles north and east. High elevation, remote, with natural hot springs that keep parts of it accessible year-round. It's territory that technically belongs to the Blackfeet Nation, which means territorial authorities have no jurisdiction, and Barrow has no claim. If you can get the lions there, they'll be beyond his reach, free to live as they were meant to live. The plan was audacious and fraught with danger, requiring Jake to abandon his homestead for weeks, to traverse difficult terrain while somehow keeping pace with a lioness and her injured cub, to risk arrest or worse if Barrow's men caught him in the act. It was everything his practical nature should have rejected immediately. And yet, as he studied the route Pierce had marked, Jake felt certainty settle over him like a warm coat on a cold night. "When do we leave?" he asked. And Pierce smiled with what looked like relief. "Not we, Mr. McGraw. I'm an old man whose knees complain about stairs. I'd only slow you down, but I can buy you time. I'll tell Barrow his dogs picked up the scent heading southwest toward Millerville. It'll take him a full day to organize a search in that direction, maybe two before he realizes he's been misled. That gives you a head start." Jake began gathering supplies with practiced efficiency, pulling down his heavy coat and winter gear, packing dried food and ammunition, rolling his bedroll tight for travel. His mind was already working through logistics and challenges, calculating how fast Lady could move with Scout, what route would offer the best cover while still being passable for a cub with a healing leg. "One more thing," Pierce said, pulling a small leather journal from his bag. "I've written down everything I know about lion behavior, medical care for the cub's injuries, signs of infection or complications to watch for. It's not much, but it might help if problems arise during the journey." Jake took the journal, feeling the weight of knowledge it contained, the careful observations of 3 decades working with animals. "Why are you doing this, Dr. Pierce? You could lose everything if Barrow finds out you helped me." The older man was quiet for a moment, staring at his weathered hands. "When I was a young man, I dreamed of studying animals in their natural habitats, of contributing to human understanding of the natural world. Instead, I ended up working for circuses and menageries, watching magnificent creatures slowly die from confinement and despair. I can't undo 30 years of compromise, Mr. McGraw, but I can help these two lions find freedom. Consider it penance for all the ones I couldn't save." The two men shook hands, and in that grip Jake felt the passing of something more than just information and supplies. It was responsibility, perhaps, or hope, or simply the recognition that some things mattered more than safety or conventional wisdom. After Pierce left, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness as quietly as he'd arrived, Jake finished his preparations and stepped out into the cool morning air. The forest was awakening around him, birds beginning their morning songs and small creatures stirring in the underbrush. Jake shouldered his pack and checked his rifle one final time, then set off toward the place where he'd left Lady and Scout the previous day. He half expected to find them gone, to discover they'd moved on during the night, putting distance between themselves and the humans who'd caused them so much trouble, but they were exactly where he'd left them. The Lioness rising to her feet as he approached, her body tense but not aggressive. Scout was awake too, its bright eyes following Jake's movements with curiosity rather than fear. For a long moment, the three of them simply regarded each other, an unlikely trio bound together by circumstance and need. Jake pulled the map from his pocket and studied the route Pierce had marked, calculating distances and elevation changes. Then he looked at Lady and spoke, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping she might comprehend his intention. "How do you feel about a walk in the mountains? 60 miles of rough country, but freedom at the end of it. Real freedom where nobody can cage you or make you perform or hurt your cub." Lady seemed to understand something had changed, that this human was offering more than just temporary shelter. She looked at Jake for a long moment, then turned and gently grasped Scout by the scruff, lifting the cub with practiced ease. When she looked back at Jake and began walking north, he took it as the invitation it was meant to be. Together, the three of them disappeared into the forest, beginning a journey that would test them all in ways none could anticipate. The first 2 days were the hardest. Scout couldn't travel far on its injured leg, requiring frequent rest stops that ate away at their precious head start. Jake carried the cub when necessary, feeling its heart beating rapidly against his chest, marveling at the trust Lady showed by allowing him such intimate contact with her offspring. They moved through dense pine forests and across rocky ridges, following game trails when possible and forging new paths when necessary. On the third day, they heard dogs baying in the distance behind them. Barrow had discovered Pierce's deception and redirected his hunters. Jake picked up the pace, pushing Lady and Scout harder than he wanted to, knowing that rest could cost them everything. They traveled through the night, Jake guiding them by starlight and the luminous face of his father's compass, while Lady stayed close, her amber eyes reflecting moonlight like twin lanterns in the darkness. The mountains grew steeper as they climbed, the air thinning and cooling until Jake's breath came in visible puffs. Scout was struggling now, the high altitude and constant movement taking their toll on the healing cub. Jake fashioned a rough sling from rope and canvas, creating a carrier that allowed him to bear Scout's weight while keeping his hands free for climbing. Lady watched this adaptation with evident approval, staying close enough to intervene but trusting Jake's ingenuity. They crossed a high pass on the 5th day, and Jake paused at the summit to look back the way they'd come. Far below, he could see smoke from multiple campfires. Barrow's hunting party spread out across the lower elevations, systematically searching the forests they'd already passed through. The distance they'd covered was impressive, testament to determination and cooperation between species, but Jake knew the hunters wouldn't give up easily. On the 6th day, Scout took its first steps without assistance since the injury, tentatively testing the splinted leg and finding it could bear weight. The little one's face was healing well too, the stitches holding firm despite the rigors of travel. Jake watched with satisfaction as Scout attempted short bursts of play, pouncing on pine cones and batting at its mother's tail, displaying the normal exuberance of healthy cubs everywhere. The valley Pierce had marked on the map revealed itself on the morning of the 8th day, spread out below them like a promised land. Steam rose from hot springs scattered across the terrain, creating patches of green vegetation even in the increasingly cold weather. Elk grazed in small herds, and Jake spotted deer tracks crossing muddy ground near the water sources. It was perfect habitat for predators willing to adapt, offering food and water and shelter in abundance. They descended slowly, Jake's heart both heavy and light with the knowledge that this was goodbye. Lady seemed to sense it too, moving with deliberate grace as if savoring these final moments of unlikely partnership. When they reached the valley floor, Scout immediately began exploring, its injured leg barely slowing it down as it investigated new smells and sounds with typical feline curiosity. Jake made camp near one of the hot springs, building a fire more from habit than need. Lady settled herself nearby, watching him with those penetrating amber eyes that had witnessed so much of his kindness and courage. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Jake felt the weight of emotion pressing against his chest. "You'll be safe here," he said quietly, his words carried away by the mountain wind. "This is Blackfeet territory, and they respect all creatures. They'll leave you alone to live as you were meant to live." Lady rose and walked to where Jake sat by his fire. She pressed her head against his shoulder one final time, purring with that deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. Then Scout came bounding over, no longer the injured, fevered creature that had first hidden beneath Jake's porch, but a young lion full of life and possibility. The cub rubbed against Jake's leg, marking him with scent, claiming him as pack in whatever way its instincts understood such things. Jake spent that night in the valley with them, his last gift of presence before the final parting. He woke before dawn to find Lady sitting beside him, keeping watch as he slept, protecting him as he had protected her. When he rose and shouldered his pack, she didn't follow. She simply watched from beside Scout as Jake walked back toward the trail that would take him home. He looked back only once, seeing them silhouetted against the rising sun, mother and cub together in freedom. Then he turned away and began the long journey back to his solitary cabin, carrying with him memories of amber eyes and rumbling purrs, of trust given and honored between beings who should have been enemies but became something far more precious. The cabin, when Jake finally reached it 2 weeks later, had been ransacked. Barrow's men had clearly searched it thoroughly, looking for evidence of the lions or proof of Jake's involvement in their disappearance. But they'd found nothing conclusive, and eventually they'd moved on, taking their frustration out on his furniture and supplies before leaving. Jake stood in the ruins of his small home and found he didn't care about the damage. Material things could be replaced. What he'd gained in those weeks with Lady and Scout, the understanding that love and trust could transcend species and circumstance, that courage sometimes meant risking everything for creatures who couldn't thank you in words, that was permanent, that was priceless. That spring, a trapper passing through Blackfeet territory reported seeing 2 lions in the high valley, a magnificent female and a young adult bearing facial scars. They were thriving, the trapper said, hunting successfully and living free under the endless Montana sky. When word reached Jake in his rebuilt cabin, he smiled and raised his coffee cup in silent toast to the most unlikely friends he'd ever known. Outside his window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward mountains that held secrets and miracles in equal measure. And somewhere up there, in a valley where hot springs steamed and elk grazed freely, 2 lions lived the life they'd always deserved, saved by a cowboy who'd answered a desperate plea and discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures began with a simple act of compassion.